Okay.
Belva, tell me about your assignment now at KRON, exactly what you're doing there.
Well, I'm at an interlude. I've just finished the coverage of the election of 1992, which for me was one of the most exciting periods of my career. It was exciting because of the fact that a topic that I thought was going to bloom many years earlier, finally, finally the blossoms came out, and that was that I covered the year of the woman in politics. And it's something that I had been projecting would happen in prior election years, and it finally happened in 1992. So at this period, I'm doing cleanup from the election, looking forward to going to the inauguration in Washington, be my first, and then coming back and sort of reassessing what I'd like to do from here on in. I know that my interest is varied, but at the bottom of all of it, generally it's about the kinds of stories that attract me are ones in which I can somehow help people who don't have a voice somehow find it. And that's a very broad way of putting it, but and that means programs and people. And this, for instance, the stories I've lined up so far, stories about developmentally disabled people who are fighting their way into the workforce under the new laws that give them the ability to push folks into doing things. So that's a story I'll do next Monday. The second story I'm doing is about a couple of young African American guys who've gone into the manufacturing business, someplace that blacks have not much of a track record. We've not been manufacturers of anything. Mostly we've been in the consuming side, the business world. So I'll do that because I think it's a new trend and hope that it'll give encouragement to others to step out there. So I don't know what I'm going to call what I'm doing, but I still have the same title of Urban Affairs Specialist for KRON, and with the privilege of trying to develop that into something that I can find some gratification doing.
When you think about your career in journalism, can you talk to me a little bit about why you got into the business and why you think what you do is important?
Well, I got into it because, of course, I'm a woman in a minority. Both of those labels would say that I was on the side of the powerless. And I think because of race first and gender second, I just felt that a large segment of our society simply wasn't being heard. And why I decided I should be a messenger is a different, it's something more complex than I can explain here. But it was the motivating reason. I just felt that we need to hear from all elements of the American society. And certainly I knew a lot about what black people were saying to each other because I started out working in the black press and in black radio. But that also put me in a position to know that there was very little exchanging of views from the two communities because I had to move often between the two worlds to do what I was doing. And so I just wanted to be part of the learning process as we got to know one another better.
In the Bay Area, where you grew up, you didn't really grow up in an area that was either white or black, really. There was a mixture of people there. Do you think that had something to do with it, growing up in Oakland and Berkeley?
Oh, I definitely do. And, but I have to say that I tried to think about who were people who were not African American, who were important in my life as a youngster, who might make me feel the way I do about this whole business of, everybody being the same, basically. And I have to say that basically it was my teachers, because I grew up. I don't think I ever had I cannot remember ever having an African American as a teacher. I don't remember, except when I was a very small preschooler. I cannot remember.
Who was your favorite teacher?
Well, I guess the one who will live with me forever was a woman who was head of our PE department at Berkeley High, a woman named Miss Ince, because she was there through some pretty tough adolescent years and sort of, you know, took a liking to me and visited my home and paid for my bowling and stood as a champion, you know, to withdraw our bowling league from the place where we bowled because they would not allow me to practice except with the school. She just canceled the whole league. I mean, she was truly a warrior.
Yeah.
So she is, you know, I will never forget.
Why wouldn't they allow
that.
you to practice?
Oh, because I was black.
Oh.
So blacks were not allowed to bowl at the Berkeley Bowl. And I was allowed to bowl there with the Berkeley High team as long as I was with the team, but I couldn't come back and practice. And the way that she found out about it is she came by one day, my house, to talk with me about continuing, because I was doubtful that I could continue because I didn't have the money to pay. And she came by to talk with me and my mother. She saw me in the driveway. We lived on Ashby Avenue in Berkeley. And I was out there practicing my bowling with a can of Del Monte string beans, rolling it down the concrete driveway. And so she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm practicing." And she said, "Well, why don't you go up to the, you know," no, she says, well, let me help you out, and, you know, I'll make arrangements so you can go and you can practice at the alley. And I said, "Well, they don't allow me to bowl there when I'm not with you." And that was...
And then she pulled the team?
Yeah. She tried to negotiate it, and they didn't want to cooperate. So she got the school somehow to, or the principal, to write to them and say that there be no more Berkeley students there.
Now, you just went back to Berkeley High this year and talked at commencement.
Yes.
And what did you tell the students that are graduating this year?
Well, mostly I told them I'd be short with my address, which I promised them. I started out by saying that I promised not to talk longer than 8 minutes.
Was there a cheer?
Sort of a sigh of relief. But I guess I wanted to let them know that Berkeley had not always been the place that they know today, that it too had developed and changed, and that Berkeley High certainly was not the school, that Berkeley High that they know certainly was not the school that I attended. But
how is the school different now from when you attended it?
Oh, well, there were very few minority students. It's, you know, that's the only high school in all of Berkeley, and there were very few blacks that lived in Berkeley. And I think in the school student body of maybe 3,000 or more, there maybe were 200 black kids, which is a lot compared to some places at that time, but wasn't very much when you scatter it through all of the grades. There were very few in my class,
And that
my
would have been
graduating
what year?
class, in 1951.
So you said, as compared to today, what should the graduates of 1992
Well,
think about?
I just tried to inspire them to realize the advantages they had, the struggles they didn't have to fight. Therefore, they needed to do their best because they were not having to pay a lot of dues for things that had nothing to do with their skills and abilities. They could be successful just by exercising their options to use what they had and to have ambitions to do. And they weren't fighting, you know, the kind of racial barriers that I had been up against, in addition to trying to be a fairly good student in a very competitive society there at in Berkeley at that time.
Also, within the last week, you said that you had gone to the screening of Malcolm X movie.
Yes.
Does that make you think about the past a lot? And did you have any
boy, did it make me think
back thoughts?
It made me think a lot about the past because as I watched the movie, I mean, Denzel Washington is so good. In my mind, I could really see Malcolm X again. And I started to feel some of the apprehension and almost fear I used to feel in his presence. I mean, he just really did frighten you. And he had, you know, these eyes that were just so piercing. And I think after the film was over, and I sort of had decided this because I remember the book well, is that the lesson that Malcolm X taught then and should be teaching students now is that we all can change and we all can evolve. We don't ever have to be what we were yesterday. We can be something else tomorrow, and we can be better tomorrow. I mean, it was all of that, and if students somehow can get even part of that out of this whole spectacle around the filming and its opening and so on, boy, it'll be worth every printed word. So it just reminded me that I had lived through an era and had personally known a man who had remade himself, and whose images and thoughts had as much validity today. That is, the thoughts that I liked. There were lots of things he said that I disagreed with at the time. And I probably, and I think I can remember being one of those doubtful as to whether he would stay the course of being the good guy that he was presenting himself to be then because of his past deeds. And remember the conflict within the black community itself of those who criticized him severely, and even was reminded during all this by a teacher who was teaching a course on Malcolm X about as late as 1974 she had lost her job for teaching about him at McClymonds High, a predominantly black school in Oakland. So I just think it reminded me a lot of, you know, what life is really all about, and that's evolving, the evolution.
Tell me about that encounter that you talked to me about before, really, with Malcolm X.
Oh, yeah. It certainly reminded me of that. And I met him at a time when I was working for a black weekly newspaper, but it was a black weekly newspaper with a white editor. Our editor was a guy that was very important in my own development, a former Associated Press reporter who'd spent years in the Far East and had, as some writers of that era, developed a real problem with alcohol, came back to this country, couldn't get a job anywhere else, so he ended up editing a black weekly paper. Well, Malcolm X was going through this period of his life when all whites were devils and we shouldn't talk to them, we shouldn't associate with them, and so on. And so, but he wanted to communicate with the black community. So he often was in the Bay Area because he was establishing a mosque here, and he'd come to the paper and he needed to explain what he wanted in the paper. But since he didn't talk to whites, he needed an interpreter. And I was the only staff person, so I would come to the desk when he'd bring his copy, and the guy that was my editor's name was Darrell Lewis, and he would stand and he'd say to me, say to this man that I want such and such. And I would turn to Darrell and I'd say, he said to tell you such and such. And Darrell would say, well, tell him I can or I can't do that. And I'd say, he said he can or he can't do that. And we'd go through this on Monday mornings as he'd drop off his copy.
You were the go-between.
Yeah,
you were the go-between.
Yeah.
But if you hadn't been there, would the story have gotten in the paper, do you think?
I don't know what would have happened. I imagine someone would have appeared who was black, who would have become the interpreter, but it just happened to fall to me that I played a part at this very key period in his life.
Let's go back to your life in the early parts of it, and starts in Louisiana, if I remember right. And talk to me about your mother and your father. Describe them to me.
Well, my mother grew up in a small town outside of the big city where I was born, of Monroe, Louisiana, and my father also. My father was born in Mississippi, and my mother in Louisiana, but in a small town. And they settled in the city of Monroe, which is a big city in Louisiana. And I was born to a teenage mom who married much too young, not equipped or ready to take care of a child. And so I ended up living with any number of relatives as I grew up, and watched them go through a very difficult and turbulent marriage, and basically spent a pretty strange and lonely childhood.
Your mother, did she work all
Yes,
the time you
yeah.
were growing up?
Oh yes, yes, my mother worked.
And your father?
Everybody in my family worked.
Mhm. And your father?
And my father worked. My father was the big guy around town. My dad was one of the few people. Louisiana in Monroe was a big lumber town, and that was one of the big industries. And my dad was one of the few people who really knew how to operate the heavy machinery. And even though he never finished grammar school, he taught himself to read. My dad taught himself to read by reading encyclopedias. And so he was a high wage earner during the Depression years of the 30s because he was a supervisor in the sawmills in Louisiana. And everybody else in my family, I mean, the women worked in the laundry, the men worked in the sawmills or the packing plants there.
And your mother?
My mother worked in the laundry along with her sister and her cousins, and they all worked in the same places.
When you talk about that family in Monroe, how many people were there, all there around there roughly, that were, just name a few of them, and
Oh, I don't know. There were so
characters
many.
in your life there?
Yes. Well, my mother was one of 3 daughters, and so my early years was spent with her, with the middle sister. And I lived with her until she died. She died of tuberculosis when I was a baby. And so then I came to live with my mother and her older sister. And then my father had 2 sisters. And at various times, this was a mosaic that I cannot describe because I was quite young then, but there were always people either moving in or moving out. But there were always lots of people. And sometimes I was moving in and then moving out. And so
Big house, little house?
I tried to think about it, whether it was big or little. I can remember that it was what they call in the South a shotgun house. And the reason they call it that is because if you stand at the door, all of the rooms, you could shoot a shotgun, it would go straight through it. So there were rooms after rooms, but I have no concept of whether it was big or little.
2-story, 1-story?
1 story that just must have had a lot of different rooms to it, the best I can recall. But it was not the situation as I grew up. I mean, I never as a child ever had a room. I don't remember even as a child ever having a bed. I remember living in different places. I was sort of portable. So I'd sleep on the floor wherever I was and whichever relative I was with. So my childhood is really mumble-jumble, mosaic, probably out of just protection of not having to deal with it.
And then at what time did you leave Louisiana to come here, and why did your family?
Well, it was my uncle, who was quite a character, who I remember now fondly, but who, oh my God, I used to have some pretty outrageous thoughts about as I was growing up, because he was such a little character. But my Uncle Ezra was just a big, feisty little guy, and he had worked at a meat packing company, and he'd had an accident. He was, I don't know, lifting a side of beef or something, and he'd hurt his back. And he did something in that time in the 30s that black people just don't do. He had sued his employer. The amazing thing to me is I know that his lawyer was white, but I've never figured out why this guy took the case. But he did. And so my uncle sued, and he won. And, I guess there was great glee and joy in the whole town, and it was the talk of the town. But I do remember that the guy, or at least either I remember I was told, I don't know which it is at this point, that the lawyer told my uncle that, as was the practice in those days in the South, that he was going to be made an example of, and he better get out of town.
What would that mean?
They said he was going to be tarred and feathered. So my dad and my uncle and some other relatives left Louisiana, and they got, I think as far as, I don't know, I think they left on a freight train. They ended up eventually getting in a car because to get to California, they really drove, but they left there. because of the need to get out secretly on a train, on a freight train.
Did
And
that
then
just happen suddenly? Was your father just
Yeah.
leaving?
Yeah.
Okay, he's going to change.
Yeah.
Well, let's get you out of Louisiana now. And your father is with your uncle, driving the car.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
And several other men. I don't know who all that, but I know there was, a group of them that all left together and
Now, did your
headed for California.
mother just come to you one night and say your father's leaving, or how did that come about? Do you remember?
No, it was whatever happened. It was. I mean, I don't think anybody ever said anything. We were It was. I mean, everyone was very excited, and the women were all tearful, and what to do was it. Nobody quite knew what to do.
And how old were you then?
Oh my goodness. Maybe 4 or 5, something like that. Yeah.
And they just were suddenly gone. And they were going to California. Did they have California as a destination? Or did
I
they
don't
just-
know. I don't know. Because everything happened in stages, and I mean, this is Louisiana of, many years ago. Parenting was not like high on the list of things that people knew a lot about then. And so I just know that the men left, then the women left. And then we were sent, my brother and I, to Arkansas to live with a set of grandparents there. And that eventually my father came and brought
Your
us to
father's
California.
parents in
Yeah,
Arkansas?
my father's dad and my stepmother there. So we lived there, and then we eventually ended up in California.
On a train? Did you
Yeah,
get to
and we
California?
came out on a train with my dad, and trains and transportation was still segregated back then. So I don't remember a lot about it except having to sit on a suitcase in the aisle for part of the trip. I thought that was a great adventure.
Sure.
I remember the train being crowded. That's about my big memories of the train ride out. It took days,
So your first memory of California is what?
Going to school in California. That was absolutely terrifying because up to now I had been totally in black surroundings. I'd never been any place where there were large numbers of whites. So this was really something, and I didn't know how to react. Plus I had the southern accent that I was bound to have, having just come from Louisiana. And also remember coming into West Oakland, where the whites who lived there were not exactly happy to see us, coming into a school system where the teachers didn't know what to do with us, with names and accents that they didn't know how to absorb, and really being made to feel less than as we started out. I mean, my parents named me Belva Jean for my grandfather's, whose name was Eugene, and my name was spelled Belvagene. And I can remember whatever grade I was in, them telling me that I had to change my name because Jean was masculine. And my name was Jean, it had to be Jean. And I do remember I was tenacious then. And I said, this is my name, this is my name. And I refused to change it. But funny, my mother did change her name.
She did.
Because my mother's name was Florine. And she was told when she started work for the Southern Pacific that there was no such name as Florine, that the name was Florence. And my mother changed her name to Florence.
She did.
I mean, we were pretty put upon, the people coming from the blacks coming from the South into California in those early days.
And it was, you were not coming to a settlement either of a lot of black people in Oakland at that time.
No.
Is that right?
That's right.
In West Oakland, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And because there were communities of blacks settling in East Oakland, weren't there at that time?
Well,
Were
in
they?
Berkeley,
In Berkeley,
there was a good group of people in Berkeley, and in North Oakland there were a few people. And I guess they're in West Oakland, there were little pockets, The people, the blacks that moved to East Oakland did not come till much later, when they built some new housing out by 98th Avenue is when people started to move to East Oakland. Yeah.
So your days at school, you were a good student?
I was a pretty good student, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And but that's because, you know, that's the solace when you don't know what else to do. You take to reading and studying. Yeah, and so that's what I did.
Did you have any particular good friends
Don't remember any.
in grammar school?
Don't remember any.
And
Not at all.
so when you wanted to read, how would you get the books that you wanted
School
to read?
library.
School library.
Yeah.
And then,
Eventually I learned where the, you know, the community library was. Because everybody in the family worked, so you had to take care of yourself after school. And you had to find something to do. And we didn't live in a very attractive place. We lived in an unfinished basement, so it wasn't any place you wanted to be. So I'd sit on the steps of we lived in an old Victorian, in the basement of this old Victorian. So I'd get books and just sit on the steps and read in the afternoon.
describe the basement for me a little bit.
Well, it was just what I said, an unfinished basement, dirt in many of the areas, you know, just as a basement's dug out. And my family would put sheets or old Chanel bedspreads over the walls to cover that part of it. And we had a kerosene stove that probably was very unhealthy. Not adequate lighting, and 11 people living there.
For how long were you in that basement?
Oh, gee, it seemed like forever. I don't know. Certainly a school year. Yeah.
And then you moved upstairs, or did you move to another place?
No, my aunt moved to Alameda, and I moved with her for a while.
Did
Yeah.
you change schools?
Yes. Yeah.
So how many times?
See, I didn't change schools right away, though.
Okay.
Didn't change schools right away. And I did that a lot during my life, where I'd be going to school in one city and living in another. And so for 1 year, I stayed at Prescott in Oakland and took the bus from Alameda. And then eventually, I started going to school in Alameda. Alameda at that time was not a very hospitable place for blacks. It was had a reputation of being very racist, and its schools being very racist and very difficult for black students. So there was some hesitation about whether I should go to school in
Now,
Alameda.
this was what?
By now,
roughly
World War II was
World War II,
during the
and
war
Alameda's
years.
being built up because of the Naval Air
Yeah, and
Station
people
there.
hated it.
Hated
And all
the
this
building, or-
influx of people going into the projects.
Is that where you went?
Yes, and they disliked us there very much.
And so then did you go to school in Alameda? And
Half day.
Half day,
Yeah, all schools were half day.
because of the war?
Yeah.
And then when you went to junior high, did you get yourself any special friends? Did you find a
Yeah,
special friend?
that's when I made the friend of my life, the very first best friend of my life, who's still my best friend. And that was when I was starting on enrollment day at Hoover Junior High School. We met.
How'd you meet?
I think because we both looked scared to death and we both wore glasses.
Is that right?
We were the two funny-looking kids. It seemed like, you know, the only thing we could do was migrate toward each other. And I believe, and this may be because I was told this by my friend's mom, but I think her mother said to her, because she was hesitant about her glasses too, "Here, Rosemary, here's another little girl with glasses. See, it's not so bad."
So you helped each other.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
I mean, nobody wants to start 7th grade with glasses, you know.
And so why is Rosemary important in your life?
Well, I think she and her mother were really, they served as sort of a turning point in my life. Even though her mom was this single mom, as my mother eventually, my mom and dad divorced. Her mother was one of the first black women that I was close to who had gone to college. And that made a difference in her thoughts and her attitudes about child raising. And I sort of became an addition to their family.
Mm-hmm. Did you spend a lot of time there?
A lot of time with them. Yeah.
And why did she particularly play such an important role? Her mother, I mean.
I think that she was the first adult that really sat down and just talked to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, explain things in detail.
Mm-hmm. Did she have a lot of interests?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
an awful lot.
Mm-hmm.
And she is a person who believes that, you know, if she can help you experience something and it's not bad for you, then even today with her grandson, she's the same
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
She should help you do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, if we wanted to go to a movie or go to a concert or do whatever,
Mm-hmm.
she would take us so that we, and you know, whereas my mother's tendency mostly was to say, you shouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
No, you can't go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, not because she was mean, but that was the way she was brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way she passed it on to her
So
children.
Rosemary's mother would take you to concerts
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, even though she was working. So you'd go in the evenings and things like
Yes.
weekends, things like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
And did she ever take you to the library?
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
In fact, Rosemary became a librarian. she is a librarian.
That's a good friend to have.
Yeah, yeah. So that common denominator stayed with us.
Mhm. And so then Rosemary's relationship, she went to high school with you?
Hmm. Well, no,
Mhm.
that's not true. I'm sorry, I just said that. We went to junior high together.
Okay.
And by the time I was in junior high, I was going to junior high in Oakland, but half of that time I lived in Berkeley.
Mm.
So by the time I graduated, again, a decision, if you're living in Berkeley, you should probably go to Berkeley High School.
Mhm.
So I did, and Rosemary was living in Oakland, and so she went to Oakland Tech.
But you still saw each other.
Oh, yes,
So
and
then,
talked on the phone and for hours.
at this time in your life, what role is the church playing in your life? Community church?
All the way through it, the church had been important because I came from a family of Baptist preachers. My godfather, who was a preacher, we used to attend his church, and so we had lots of activities. They had programs on Sunday, what was it called, the Baptist Youth something. I mean, so we'd go to church in the morning at 11, we'd do that. They'd have a 3 o'clock program, and at 5 o'clock they'd have the youth thing, and at 7 o'clock they'd have the evening services. So you just sort of stayed in church and you socialized around that all day almost. And then you had choir practices on other nights, and so the church was very much a social center.
Did you sing?
I tried. Oh, I tried, but I was never very good.
So,
oh, dear.
you graduated from Berkeley High in 51, and then what were your choices?
Well, I had, in school, I was always, I grew up with this sense of uncertainty about my life, so I went to summer school every year while I was in high school, and eventually graduated with a double major of business. In KE's, I had to get a job typing, which I was never very good at, but I took it anyway, and an academic major so that I could go on to college. And applied and got accepted, but then even with the meager fees that were required back then, there was just not enough money for me to go to.
Berkeley was essentially down the street, so to speak.
Yeah,
Really?
but it was no chance whatsoever. I was accepted at State, where most of all of my friends were going.
San Francisco State.
San Francisco State.
Mhm.
And thought I was going to be going there, but anyway, I don't know, the $200 or the $400 that I needed for books and fees just wasn't there, so I took a job. Always being one thinking ahead, I had taken a civil service exam and I had passed, and so I was a GS2 clerk typist, and so I started out working.
Where your mother
Hated
worked,
it.
didn't you? Did you work?
My dad had worked at the Naval Supply Center.
Naval Supply
Yeah.
Center. So you
My
were,
dad had been a carpenter at the Naval Supply Center, and so he knew the ropes there about how you go about applying, and so I got a job there. And but all my friends were in school, were in college, and they were all pledging sororities and doing all of these things. And I've never felt so lonely in my life because it was they were people that I'd grown up with through the junior high and high school years.
you
We're
were
all
living at
into-
home with your mom at this point?
I was living with my Yeah, with a number of people again. We were living at my aunt's house.
Okay.
And by then my mother had married, mother and father had divorced, and my mother had married again, and she now had 2 more children by her second marriage. And so we were all living together. And so I decided to get married.
You just decided that one
Just
day?
decided to get married.
It's not quite that simple, is it?
The guy that lived next door to me, who's the only person I'd ever gone out with, number one, which was really pretty sad. It's very sad.
You still wearing the glasses now?
Yes. And he lived next door, and it's the only person I dated. And he had gone into the military during his, just cannot recall whether, I think it was his senior year in college. And I don't know why, except maybe he was drafted, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe he was going to be drafted, and so he went in. I'm not sure why he went in, but he did. He went in the Air Force. So we got married, and then I moved to Washington, D.C.
Where your
my son was born.
son was born?
Yeah. And lived there for a while. And then we were transferred to Hawaii. Lived there for a while. And came back home. And it was at that point that I think I finally started to grow up.
This is about 1950, in the 50s.
Yeah, mid-50s.
Mid-50s.
Finally started to grow up.
And your daughter is?
My daughter's not born
Not
yet,
born yet.
but started to grow up because I started to just think about what I wanted to do with my life. And
Do you remember a moment in which you made a conscious decision about what you wanted to do?
not the day or the week or any of that, but I think part of it was that I told you about my love of reading, and just decided that I'd always kept long diaries, so decided I wanted to write. And I met someone who, a photographer, who was taking photographs for Johnson Publication, was just starting its Jet magazine and its publishing empire then, and needed someone to write the cut lines and the accompanying stories for that. And so I started gathering information and sending off with these photographs, and by doing that, I became a phone pal of one of the editors of Johnson Publication, who thought I had possibilities as a writer and would spend it wouldn't pay me, but would spend a lot of time cultivating this little seed. And I kept getting bigger and bigger assignments to interview
You're still
people.
working full time, aren't you?
Still working full time. And so then this interest led me to getting a part-time job with a black weekly paper. And so now I'm working my full-time government job, and I'm contributing to the Johnson paper, and I'm doing a weekly column for this newspaper. And I could see that what I enjoyed was the writing and all of that. And eventually decided I was going to try to do that. And also decided that the marriage was never made in heaven. It wasn't my choice. It wasn't the kind of guy that I would have picked as an adult for myself. But was not the kind of guy who would say, okay, you can have an easy divorce and let's go our separate ways. So we had a very strange and mysterious parting, and I left and came back and quit my government job and became a temp worker, and kept doing these part-time jobs that I enjoyed that paid very little or no money. And eventually worked my way into doing 4 or 5 part-time jobs, enough to take care of the same year I made this decision, incidentally. It was very, very smart of me. Was the same year my daughter was born. So when I left the marriage, she was maybe 2 months old.
You didn't leave it in a conventional way.
No.
Okay, we're ready to go.
Well, tell me about your unconventional exit here.
Oh, well, I'm sure part of this must have come from some of the books that I was reading then. You know, it must have come from some intrigue novel that I put together. But I had tried to work out some arrangements with my ex, And he just said that he was never going to allow me to get a divorce, you know, and he was rather threatening about it. So I had this grand scheme that I put together with this 2-month-old child and a 6-year-old who had to keep the secret. I arranged for a moving company to come after my husband that time went after he left for work. The moving van came, emptied the house of all of the things that I wanted. I left him the essentials. I had purchased a car, which I went down to pick up that day, and they had a certain amount of time that they could get things out of the house. And I piled the children and the essentials in the car, and we just became vagabonds for about a month. While my ex hired detectives to look for us, and it was really intriguing. That should be a little book right there.
Yeah, right. What happened?
Yeah. So we traveled California, and we lived in small hotels and motels up and down the state.
Want to stop?
Yeah, I got a phone. Okay.
So anyway, we just took off, and I really didn't have a destination. I'd gone to AAA and got maps and all of this. And I think we felt the safest in the Central Valley. We'd find these cheap little motels, and we'd stay there. And I always wonder, you know, what kind of scars this left for my son. I don't know if he ever knew what was happening. But I remember they didn't have car seats like today, and the car seat for my daughter was sort of like a basket that was denim collapsible. And I wasn't a very good driver. This was also part of the scheme. I had paid for driving lessons along the way.
And unbeknownst to your husband?
Yeah,
He didn't
oh
know?
no, he knew I was taking the driving lessons. So I wasn't very, so obviously I can remember stopping too fast, and the baby careening forward, and my son getting hysterical because you know she'd scream. Oh dear! So his payoff was that we ended up in Southern California, and I can't remember what. I don't know. I guess we ended up in Los Angeles. It was some treat he wanted in Southern California.
Yeah.
And that was it. If you're good, you know, we'll do this.
So you came back.
So we came back, and I took an apartment and signed up with a temp agency and worked clerical temporarily, and started back working full-time at the Bay Area Independent newspaper and working part-time at a small radio station, and continuing to contribute weekly to Jet Magazine, and took care of my 2 children. But with some trepidation, because my ex-husband was always threatening us. And then he finally took me to court to try to gain custody of the children. That was a big moment. I think I grew up a lot during that process.
So
And
when you think about that period, I think today people who would see you reporting would say, well, it must have been easy for her to start out in the business. What would you say to those people?
oh, they should spend an evening trying to explain to a 7-year-old why having tomatoes only for dinner on the 3rd night was a wonderful thing because it had lots of vitamin C. This was a funny period. I had another friend of mine who was a mother of 5 and trying to make it on her own, again in media. And our salvation was that at least she had a house and was smart enough to plant a garden. And there was one period when we were both so poor and we were both so proud, and neither of us would go to our parents for money or friends, and we just tried to make it on our own. And we actually, at the end of one pay period, got down for 3 days where all we had were tomatoes from her garden to feed the youngsters. You know, outside of, I mean, we had bread, you know, and milk, but
No meat.
No meat. And we fried them, stewed them, juiced them.
It doesn't seem to have hurt you a whole lot.
No,
What do you think about tomatoes today?
I love them.
Okay.
They were salvation, and they were healthy. We took the green ones, and we were both from Louisiana, and we'd put cornmeal and something on them, and we'd pan fry them. so that they look like little patties to fool the kids.
Steak. That's why they call it a steak tomato.
Yeah.
Oh, so it wasn't easy, huh?
No, it was not easy. But I don't remember thinking of it as hard.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't. I don't remember thinking of it as difficult. Well, difficult maybe, yes. Trying, maybe, yes. Challenging
Mm-hmm.
would probably be a better word,
Mm-hmm.
to figure out how to make it all work. And
So what came up next to help you out here?
well, getting the radio job was really helpful. And because it opened a whole new door outside of print, and I found that radio paid a little bit more. And so that
Tell me your
helped.
moniker. What was your moniker on the radio?
Oh, I didn't ever assume one of those names. In fact, I got some advice early on in my career because I came into radio at a time when everybody had a name. And there's a guy I worked with named Jumping George Oxford. And he worked at the station and was the #1 DJ at the station KSAN in San Francisco where I worked. And he wanted to change stations to KDIA, where I eventually ended up. He got into a big legal battle with the owners of the station as to who owned his name. And ended up, they owned his name, and he had to
So what
assume a
did he
new
become?
identity. Well, he had to take his own name on
Oh.
by then. He became George Oxford, but he'd been Jumping George before that. Well, anyway, out of all that, a fellow who worked with him told me never use any name except my own, because otherwise, what would I do when I went to my next job?
So you were.
So I learned my lesson. So I had the Belva Davis show. That was my show, and
And what did the Belva Davis show consist of?
well, it was an invention of the times. I had so many interests. The Saturday shows probably came from my early days in the movies of what I thought a radio show ought to be, from looking at Hollywood's interpretation of what a radio show should be. I'm sure that I must have looked at movies that had shows like this, because it was certainly an imitation of something that came from I don't know where. But the Saturday shows were luncheon shows with live guests, with a grand piano in the studio, and I'd have artists that were appearing in town. I mean, Mel Torme, Horace Silver, whoever was in town who was silly enough to come over to Oakland on a Saturday morning at 11 o'clock would be my guest, and I had studio audience. And I would have lunch that I would fix myself. The products would come from the people who were advertising on my program.
And so the products were?
Well, the people, one of the tools of selling my show was that you'd get this, this great marketing tool by having your products served to the listening audience. So I had Foster Farm chicken, so we'd have fried chicken. I had Del Monte Cling peaches. I had Del Monte Foods, so we'd have Del Monte Cling peaches, fried, the fried chicken and the peaches. And we had Wonder Bread, so we'd have sliced white bread. God, I can't remember what else, but there was something else that went with this. But mostly whoever was advertising on the show, I'd fix all this stuff and we'd have this big spread.
And it was about lunchtime.
Yeah, so the show program was on the air from 11 to 12. So we'd do the program, I'd play records, then we'd have the live guest on, sometimes the guest would perform, and we'd spin out the records, and then when it was over, we'd all have lunch together.
Which you'd cook.
And of course, I've never had a job that was just my job. My jobs were always my family's job.
Oh, so? What did this
And my
mean?
poor husband, he has had to do everything. And he was the still
This is another
photographer.
new husband.
My new husband, the husband of 30 years, who really was the change agent in my life. I think he was the guy that taught me that men could be compassionate, sympathetic, all of the things the macho image of men in those days were not. He was. And just a marvelous, sensitive human being. And he played a great role in all of this development. I mean, from the time when I was pregnant with my daughter before my divorce, my messenger for getting my columns and my materials mailed and picking up loose ends for me. He was my best friend all during those years. Of course, I went off and dated all kinds of other people in between because he was only my buddy. But eventually, I got smart because of Nancy Wilson, the singer.
Really?
One day, because we used to work together a lot. He was my still photographer. When I'm rambling again,
Yeah.
so we'll get back. Get on
That's all
point
right.
in a minute.
We'll get back to the fried chicken.
Yeah, but one day I was doing this show with Nancy, and the second time around, I think, and we came in, and he was taking the pictures, and Nancy says, "God, this guy's so nice. Why don't you marry this guy? I mean, what are you going around with all these drummers and all these musicians for? You don't want to marry any of those guys." And she sort of planted the seed, and eventually I got wise, and I did. I married him.
And
But,
wasn't this kind of a trade-off too? I mean, wasn't this a trade that down in Carmel when you got married?
Oh God! Well, I mean, we decided we were going to get married, but we didn't know when. We were both real busy building careers and all this, and so we got a marriage license. And one day he called up, and I don't know what one of us said. You know, we've had that marriage license. I don't know how long it was, and I mean, he paid our $3, which was a big joke, because I paid the $3. So he always tells me that I paid to marry him. But anyway, he had this marriage. He said it was going to expire today, and I said, so we said, what do we do about it? And he says, well, you want to get married today? And I said, well, I suppose so. What do you think? And he says, well, I said, yeah, but I got to finish the logs, because I was a traffic manager for the radio station. I could not go without tomorrow's logs. So we said, okay, well, then when we get through tonight, let's call some friends and let's see what we can do. So I did. After work, I went to Rosemary, my best friend, borrowed a suit and a hat from her, and we got in a friend, Ralph Jones's Volkswagen Bug, and we started out. I had called that day because I had always heard these dream things about the Highlands Inn in Carmel, and I wanted to be married at the Highlands Inn. So we get in this little VW, and we decided we're going to go to Carmel. So I called there and I tell them I want to get married, and they said, well, they'd arrange for a minister. And we stopped off South of Market, and we had our bachelor party in some bars at South of Market. We drove to Carmel, and we got there, and there was this strange little minister there, and he had a little record of the wedding music. My husband brought along a still camera that he could put on tripod with slow shutter speed. And so we played this thing, and then finally Rosemary said, well, what are you going to do? You don't have any flowers. And Bill said, well, they got plenty of them out in the garden. And so he, in the middle, this is quite late in the evening, cut flowers at the Highlands Inn, and he gave to me. And so we were married by the guy whose name I still don't know. And we stood together like a, what do you call it, the photograph, I'm trying to remember the artist, why can't I, great American artist.
Norman Rockwell?
Norman Rockwell movie, painting, and had our wedding picture done. And then we drove home.
Took your own wedding pictures?
We took our own wedding pictures. We drove home. He went home. He dropped me off at my house, and he went home. Because we hadn't told anybody that we were getting married. And we thought we should wait till the next day and tell the kids. So that was the beginning of 30 years of wonderful marriage.
So you say his support's been very important
key,
in your career.
important.
You think, why?
Wouldn't have happened without him. I don't think you could have done what I did in those days without somebody who was there to hold your hand and to support you and love you through the scary moments. And
what was the scariest moment?
Oh my God, there is no one moment that I can distinguish. There were so many. You know, you're talking about somebody here who knew nothing. I mean, no training in journalism, no training in broadcasting, you know, no training in anything, who keeps stepping up one step higher and feeling as though you're climbing a mountain and you're going to finally get to the top of the volcano and maybe you're going to drop right into the lava. So that's how my career went. And so, you know, there we were going along together. I meant he was still photographer when I was with the newspapers. He switched over and became a publicity photographer when I went into radio. And then when I went into television, he became a news photographer and changed to film at that time.
So how did you decide to leave radio and the chicken fest and go into television?
Well, radio really left me. Radio changed. that was when formatted radio came along, when playlists were developed, and personalities and interviews and interesting things like that went by. And you got a 20 record playlist and you played it, and you didn't deviate, and you gave the time at 05, and you gave the weather at 09, and you know, you did this. And you know, it was like computerized television, radio. So I just said, well, gee, you know, there must be some place where the industry hasn't grown up yet. And of course, that embryonic business was television news, which was just getting out the gate.
How did you figure this out?
I tell you, I read a lot. I mean, I would read anything that ended up in front of me, upside down or backwards. And I don't know, I read some articles and that were, you know, looking at where the business was going, and just decided that I ought to try to get involved. And a lot of it, I'm sure, had to do with the evolution that was going on in the country at that time. Television was becoming the instrument for blacks to tell their story. The Huntley Brinkley show, the showing of the demonstrations in the South were really changing America. And I'm sure all of that played a part in it. But there were no black people telling you about any of that.
On the West Coast.
There were few in America, telling you about
Certainly
it.
none on the West Coast.
There
So
were few in America
it wasn't like you made a decision to join a profession that already had somebody like you in it, is that right?
No.
So
I never saw anybody that looked like me. I know there were women on the East Coast, but there were none in California. So I never saw anyone
but
on
that
the
didn't
air.
seem to bother you too much.
No, because I'd lived a life of uncharted courses. So, but, you know, there's no reason to change now. So, and beside that, you know, I think that's all like a gamble anyway. You may as well go for what you want if you're going to be out there trying. You know, why content yourself with struggling with something that you really don't want to do? So. And I really did not want to be a clerk. I knew that much, that I hadn't enjoyed that. And I think the one thing I have to give the Navy credit for the years I worked as a clerk for the Navy, I worked some of those years in a department of the Navy that supplied secret and top secret pamphlets and books to Navy fighter planes and so forth. A boring job where I worked in a vault most of the time, issuing those kinds of things. But you gave me lots of time to read other things around a Navy book cover. So it helped me to develop. I had lots of time to think, lots of time to read.
Figure out that television was coming. So how did you go about training yourself to be this television journalist?
Change here.
Okay, we'll change.